A very good morning. Terrific Tuesday today. Wishing you a good one. Welcome to today's episode of Morning Well. Talk about three things: manufacturing to the rescue, US bankruptcy filings, and EV mover QuantumScape. US stocks stumbled in volatile trading as surging infections increased global economic concerns. The Dow cratered in early afternoon trading, dropping by as much as 725 points. It ended with a loss of about 383 points. Tuesday's Senate runoffs in Georgia contributed to the jitters. While indexes spared some losses late, the S&P 500 still suffered its worst day in almost 10 weeks. The Dow was down 1.3%, the S&P was down 1.5%, while the Nasdaq Composite also was down by 1.5%. But the volatility in stocks was nothing compared to the action in cryptocurrencies. The price of Bitcoin, which had surged by nearly a fifth over the long holiday weekend, plunged about 17% on Monday morning. Not every asset suffered though. Gold prices jumped, so did the shares of Tesla, which reported some impressive delivery numbers. Treasuries were little changed. The 10-year yields hovered around the same 0.92. The 10-year break-even rate, which is like an inflation expectations reading, rose as high as about 2.01%, a level that was seen more than 2 years ago. The dollar was mixed, with the pound the worst G10 performer. Asian equity futures are in the red. On the oil front, most OPEC members, including Saudi Arabia, were opposed to increasing oil output again next month, but Russia proposed the maximum 500,000 barrel a day supply hike. Energy Minister of Saudi highlighted the risk of oversupplying a fragile market, calling the more contagious virus strain a worrying and unpredictable development. Algeria, Nigeria, Oman and UAE were also in favor of holding supply steady, is what some of the delegates said. WTI was lower by about 2.4%. Among individual stock moves, Coca-Cola fell by about 3.8% after RBC Capital analysts downgraded the stock to sector perform from outperform, saying they believe the pandemic will continue to limit major public events and dining at restaurants, potentially hurting demand for Coca-Cola's products. Airline stocks and hotel operators were down. American Airlines was down by about 4.1% and Hilton was down by about 3.4%. In other markets, the Euro Stock 600 rose 0.7%, pairing some earlier gains. UK was higher. The FTSE 100 added about 1.7%. The trade deal struck on Christmas Eve between the UK and the European Union is likely delivering a boost to British stocks, is what an analyst at Invesco remarked. On the manufacturing front, factories in the US, Asia and Europe boosted their output as 2020 drew to a close, aided by a rise in new orders and revival in trade that has continued despite a sharp rise in coronavirus infections across many large economies. The resilience of the global manufacturing sector contrasts with weakness in services businesses that rely on close physical proximity and which have suffered as consumers try to lower the risk of infection and governments impose restrictions on their behavior. Surveys of purchasing managers at factories across Asia, Europe released on Monday recorded strong rises in activity during December, with Taiwan manufacturing sector in fact recording its strongest month in almost a decade. The results of a similar survey of US manufacturers also pointed to an increase in activity. Despite a rise in infections in both the US and Europe that have prompted governments to impose or extend restrictions, manufacturers continue to report a recovery from sharp declines in output that accompanied the pandemic's first wave and lockdowns that accompanied it. A point to note here, in China, the main driver of GDP growth has been manufacturing and industrial activity and the exports that have come from that activity. In the US, consumer and services are really at the core of their economy. Now we are seeing the manufacturers really step up and give a little bit of that support to the GDP growth. On some US bankruptcy filing news, there were about 244 US bankruptcy filings by companies with more than 50 million in liabilities in 2020, the most for a year since 2009. Companies in the consumer discretionary and energy sectors dominate the distress. The pandemic has caused permanent damage to sectors like retail, leisure and travel, making a second wave of bankruptcies look likely this year. Broadcom and Home Depot were among the 7 high-grade companies out of gates with new issues on Monday. While the first week of January is usually busy with some calling for about 30 billion in sales of bonds, the month should be lighter than normal as companies are sitting on high cash balances from record debt issuances in 2020. This is according to Bank of America. Lastly, on the back of Tesla, Chinese EV makers also gained in the US on strong December figures. NIO and Li Auto also climbed, with Wedbush seeing overall EV sales potentially doubling in the region over the next few years. One loser in Monday's EV movers was QuantumScape. The battery maker's shares had surged since its November 27th merger with a SPAC, pushing its market value to a high of nearly 50 billion last month. It dropped 41%, taking its value to 18.2 billion. Separately, Tesla and Panasonic have reached an agreement on battery cell pricing in 2021 relating to Panasonic supplying lithium-ion battery cells manufactured in Japan. That's the update. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.